All right. Good morning, everyone. It is really wonderful to have you all here, and I hope you had a lovely start to your day. The English philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "The only thing that will redeem mankind is cooperation." Hello, everyone. I'm Gautam Vardhanarayan, and I welcome you all to this wonderful brand new space of Sunway University, the Q360 lecture room. And as a speaker standing on this platform, it is slightly intimidating, but the value of spaces like these is that it creates an audience-centric view where while we accommodate more people, it also creates for better engagement and better visibility of the audience members themselves. So with that in mind, I welcome you all as well to engage with and listen to the public lecture that we have here today, as well as the panel discussion on the topic of the future of ASEAN in a multipolar world. And without much further ado, I would like to invite on stage the Vice President of Asia for the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Professor Wu Wingtai. Over to you.
Good, good morning. Welcome, Tan Siri, to your own lecture hall. And let us give a round of applause to Jeffrey Sachs, who is coming to Sunway again. We meet at a time when the world is in total disarray. Economies identify the engine of growth to be international trade. And the international trade system is now shattered in pieces. And parts of the world are on fire. We have it certainly over Iran, the Middle East in general, Pakistan-Afghanistan border, and actions of severe sanctions in the Caribbean on Cuba. The post-World War II global governance architecture has collapsed. That architecture was designed in Yalta in Russia in 1945, when the two major powers, Russia, USSR then, and the United States, divided the world up into spheres of influence. That's why we have North Korea versus South Korea, North Vietnam versus South Vietnam, Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. That system is now irrelevant because many things have changed. Possibly the single biggest event that tipped that old architecture off to the abyss is the emergence of China. Basically, instead of a bipolar order, or some would describe bipolar disorder of the past, we now have multipolar disorder. And the major nations know that there's one thing they mustn't do is to engage in a war amongst themselves, being nuclear powers. That certainly guarantees mutual annihilation. So everybody sees the future to be one of a new Yalta, where the world will be redrawn into spheres of influence. And since that conference is yet to be held, there is now a race among the major powers to expand their spheres of influence as much as they can, so that they have bargaining power. When they do meet, Russia grabbed Ukraine. China tells us that the South China Sea, defined by the 9 dashed lines that come up to the very borders of the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, is Chinese territory. And the United States has kidnapped Maduro from Venezuela, took back the ports on both sides of the Panama Canal from Li Ka-shing, and asking for Canada to be the 51st state and Greenland to be 52nd. Well, what does the future hold for a non-superpower but important coalition like ASEAN? So to bring in an objective view, we bring in an outsider. Jeffrey Sachs will tell us what's the future that we are likely to see. But the more important question is, what is the future we in ASEAN want, and how can we achieve it? So Jeff, please come forward and tell us what you see. I think you are mic'd up, right?
I am mic'd. Yeah.
You are mic'd up.
Wow. Congratulations. Oops. Congratulations on this beautiful setting. Isn't it remarkable? And Tansri, bravo. Maybe the volume a little bit lower so I'm not getting an echo. Yeah. Great to see everybody. And thank you for coming to have a good discussion about the future of ASEAN and the future of the world, and what better time to have it than in these very unusual circumstances that we're in right now. Yet another war, and one that could turn absolutely disastrous, and one that is completely unnecessary, has no purpose. They can't even figure out the justification. It changes day to day, hour to hour. We have to read Truth Social to understand, or to fail to understand the world that we're in right now. I want to try to give my own explanation of why we're in this situation. It's not, in some ways it's quite dangerous and quite grim, but in other ways it's actually with a bit of hope in it, because I don't think that what we're seeing is a worldwide madness. I would put the madness more specifically to a very few places. Unfortunately, one of them is Washington, which is both powerful and mad at the same time. But the world is not quite falling apart, but we are in the midst of a very major, deep, profound transformation. And that's what I want to talk about in general, and then talk about ASEAN within that. And I hope by the time my rambling has ended, we're feeling a little bit better, actually, about the world circumstances, because at a fundamental level, we have cause for hope of a bright future if we can find our way past the foolishness and the senselessness that are enveloping us right now. So I wanted to show you a few slides that give you my understanding of our situation. And if I could have them, I would like to take you through. There we are. So my understanding of the situation is that we are being driven by a very irascible and a bit unstable United States into crisis, and that this is a crisis that is overwhelmingly a US caused crisis. But if we get over it, things will look a lot better. That's my main message. This is not a worldwide crisis of madness. This is a US petulance that we're observing right now. And it's a petulance that fundamentally is because the world is changing in a way that American strategists, such as they are, did not foresee or understand. And sorry. would that help?
Yep.
Okay. Did not foresee and understand and are reacting to in a very dangerous way, compounded by the fact that we have a complete nitwit as president. That's the appropriate technical title. To be a little bit more technical, he is profoundly mentally unstable, which is not a good job recommendation for President of the United States. And so we seriously have a very particular short-term problem and a longer-term, deeper problem. This is essentially the problem seen from the United States. These are the shares of world output of the United States and China, measured by the International Monetary Fund in what's called purchasing power parity prices. It means that when you compare economies, you take a common set of prices for all the goods and services in the economy as the basis for comparison. This is different from taking the actual prices that you would find in the economy and then measuring the output at the actual prices. You use a common set of prices to compare the two economies, the purchasing power adjusted prices. When we just walked into the wonderful bookstore here, for example, and how gorgeous it is and how much time I'm going to spend in that bookstore in the coming days. The books are roughly about a fourth of the price that I would pay in a bookstore in New York. If we were measuring GDP at market prices, the GDP in Malaysia would look much lower as a result of that, because you would add the prices of all the books that were sold as part of final demand. And it would be a fourth of the US level, even if the same number of books happened to be sold. If you measure the GDP at a common set of prices, you would measure by books essentially, or you would use an average of Malaysian prices and New York prices and use that as the single base for comparison. And then you'd find out that in comparison, a lot more books are being sold in Malaysia than would be measured if you just took the ringgit value and converted it to US dollars at the market exchange rate. So what these data show is a valid comparison of China and the United States. And the most important point is what happened in 2016. China became a larger economy than the United States. And look back to the 45-year period when Deng Xiaoping's reforms started in China. By this measure, China was around 2% of world output. The United States was around 22% of world output. China was a no-show, and American strategists were worried about the Soviet Union. They were not worried about China in any sense. China was poor. It would become a nice place to assemble iPhones, but it was not a place to worry about. And of course, most of our strategists and politicians are economically ignorant, let's say. So even if there were reasons to understand that the world would change in the future, they were not understanding those basic points at all. And I know that from personal experience, because 30 years ago I wrote a book called Emerging Asia for the Asian Development Bank, where I projected that China would have a remarkable period ahead. You never heard of the book because it came out about 3 weeks before the Asian financial crisis. It was a very optimistic book about Asia. It was very embarrassing at the time because Asia collapsed 3 weeks after the book, not because of the publication of the book, But in any event, it meant that this optimistic forecast looked a little wrong to the sponsor of the study, which was the Asian Development Bank. But it turned out that the forecast was almost precisely right that I made in 1997. I said that between 1995 and 2025, the share of Asia in the world output would rise by 20 percentage points, that Asia's share would go from 30% of world output to 50% of world output. This is exactly what happened. I said 20%, it wasn't exactly those numbers, but the rise was exactly 20%. And China, of course, was at the center of this. This is the basic reason for the geopolitical instability that we are facing. Not that China's rise is per se geopolitically destabilizing. Rather, China's rise is driving America nuts at the political level. It is, to put it technically, freaking out the Americans. Washington doesn't know what to do. The United States, as a political system, is told daily that the rise of China is the greatest threat to the United States in our history, that this is the most dangerous competitor America has ever faced. Partly on that basis, a complete imbecile has twice been elected president, Mr. Trump. And partly on that basis, the United States is now engaging in countless wars. And to my mind, this graph is the single core explanation of what is happening, which is that the United States is finding it extremely difficult to adjust to a multipolar world. What is a multipolar world? It's a world where there is not one power center and not even two power centers, because the idea of G2, which is quite popular in some international discourse, the US and China, is also not correct. India will be a very significant power. Russia is a very significant power. Europe, if it ever got its head together, it's even more confused than the United States, would also be a very significant power. We would have many centers of power in the world with advanced technologies, with large economies, with nuclear weapons, by the way, which mean that no one of these centers can defeat militarily any of the others. We are in a multipolar world already, but we are not in what I call a multilateral world. Multilateral, in my usage of the term, means that these various powers agree on a system of cooperation that is stable, safe, secure, mutually accommodating, and mutually respectful. The idea should be that these major powers know when not to trespass on the other powers and not to push the other powers to the point of war, and much less nuclear war. But this is where I think the biggest problem is. The US political system, and it's very hard to generalize because this is not the American public, for example, which is very much against the war in Iran and has no interest in the United States engaging in another war like this. But the American political system, headed by the president, at least on the face, and including the power structures of the US, which are especially the CIA and the military, have not come to grips with the fact that we are a multipolar world. And they don't want a multipolar world. They planned, at least since the end of the Soviet Union, that the United States was the sole superpower and that would remain the sole superpower. and that there would be no talk of multipolarity, but only of US dominance. One doesn't know exactly what to make of Mr. Trump, because I do believe he is mentally ill, by the way, and I mean that in a very literal clinical sense, and the clinicians that I speak with agree with me that he is a malignant narcissist, that he's a psychopath, and maybe he's also partly demented. Our last president became fully demented on the job, so we're not doing well these days in choosing leaders, which is another sign of a political system that is in very deep crisis. But if you listen to Mr. Trump, which may be picking up in the air the things he hears around him, the whole talk is about the United States as the all-powerful country that can smash anybody, defeat anybody, bring any country to its knees. Trump himself is frenzied and delusional. It's not a tactic, by the way. He's nuts. But he is hearing things around him that he's distilling and putting into this Truth Social about the power of the United States. And that sense is, of course, being profoundly threatened by this reality that China, in many ways, is not only a pure competitor, it's actually far ahead of the United States in a number of areas, not in all areas by any means, but that is the great agony that the United States is facing now. It's then interpreted through a kind of insanity, but the US is flailing around to try to keep its dominant power. That is the essence, in my opinion, of what's happening right now. They don't want to lose their dominance. And the war in Iran, or the invasion of Venezuela, or many other actions are part of a semi-coherent, although delusional, attempt to maintain global hegemonic status. In other words, to remain number one and somehow to put China in its place in the same way that they put the Soviet Union in its place in the imagination of the American leaders. Here's another graph to make a similar point. The BRICS, of course, is the grouping that includes China, Russia, Brazil, India, South Africa is the original 5, and now includes 5 more members: Ethiopia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Indonesia. 10 countries. Those 10 taken together are considerably larger in economic output than the G7 countries. The G7 being the group of leading countries that used to dominate the world scene: the United States and Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. But today, the 10 BRICS countries have a share of world output of about 40%, and the G7 countries have a share of world output of about 28%. And that is just a further amplification of the crisis as seen from the United States and from Europe. The Western world dominated the world for centuries, and that dominance is over. It ended somewhere around the year 2000. It has not ended in the imagination of the United States yet. Europe is a very confused place also. We could spend hours trying to dissect the confusions of Europe. But on the one hand, Europe has all the instincts of empire that had developed over many centuries. Britain in London is even more delusional than Washington, because Britain still thinks they run the world, actually. You listen to Mr. Starmer, it's like being in another planet. He's running a small economy that can barely keep its clinics open, but he's sending his warships everywhere. He's still managing the British Empire, though there is no empire. It's been gone for 80 years, but they don't know it yet. France is roughly the same way. Macron, every few days, thinks he's Napoleon. So the mindset is also very confused in Europe. It's a little bit more confused because they're also completely terrified of Russia. And they're terrified of Russia on completely irrational grounds as well. And the reason that they're terrified of Russia is that Russia struck back at the aggression of the United States. It did not aggress on its own. The interpretation of the Ukraine war that is the popular interpretation in the English language media is that out of the blue in 2022, Russia attacked its neighbor because it wanted to recreate the Russian Empire. This is a trivial absurdity. Russia struck back because starting in 1992, the United States said that it wanted to surround Russia with military bases all through Eastern Europe, up to and including Ukraine and the South Caucasus region, to replay what Britain and France did to Russia in the Crimean War, which was to try to banish Russia from the Black Sea region. And this was the explicit strategy of the United States to create NATO surrounding Russia. And when that was not working because the Ukrainians didn't want to become part of NATO, to overthrow the government of Ukraine in February 2014 to bring in a government that would want to support NATO enlargement. And that created a war, quite obviously. And that war now has Europe terrified that it's about to be overrun by Russia. So Europe is a very confused place. Half of Europe's instinct is we're still a world-leading empire, and the other half is we're about to be invaded by the hordes of the Tatars coming from the east, and we need the protection of the mighty United States to save us from the Russian hordes. And that's why you don't hear one sensible word coming out of any European leader about anything. Anything. I've waited years for one sensible idea from Mr. Macron or German Chancellor or Mr. Starmer. I've given up on England. We're never going to get a sensible idea. But from Europe, you don't hear any sense. Again, the basic point, ladies and gentlemen, is this picture, which is that the so-called Western world has been eclipsed. Why is this? Well, there's a long-term reason and there's an important short-term reason. The long-term reason is, if you look at the numbers, Asia is 60% of the world population, and it declined to about 20% of world output by 1950 after 2 centuries of European imperialism. And now it's recovering lost ground. So Asia is simply recovering at a long historical period the centrality that Asia has played in the world system for 2 millennia. And that is as the center of gravity of the world economy. Most people live in Asia, and that's where most of world output was until a very short, specific period of European dominance. which ended after 2 world wars. And now Asia is achieving a very rapid comeback because of the second factor that I would mention, and that is that Asia broadly has been at peace, whereas the Western world is perpetually at war. China has not been in any war for 47 years, and that war that China was in lasted 30 days. It was a skirmish, effectively, with Vietnam in 1979. And since then, no wars. What has China been doing? It's been saving and investing and innovating and building infrastructure and building industry. Whereas the United States, to show its mettle and its dominance and its hegemony, has been in non-stop war for 30 years with Iraq, with Afghanistan, with Libya, with Syria, with Iran repeatedly. And we've squandered probably about $10 trillion in all of this effort, which even for the US is not small change. It has been the difference of investing and not investing, whereas China has been investing constantly, consistently, and very intelligently during this period. So this is the most basic point. Let me try to explain along these lines, what is it that the US actually thinks it's doing, why that's dumb, what they're doing, and how we could be doing much better, and where ASEAN fits into all of this. So the US has actually pretty formally a doctrine of world dominance, or a doctrine of hegemony. And that is stated policy of the United States, that the US should be the dominant power in the world. This goes back actually centuries, because even when the United States was nothing more than small British colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America, the colonists thought they were something special, that they were, this was a God-given new venture that would light the world. So the sense of American exceptionalism is actually a 4th century long idea. Maybe every society has its sense of exceptionalism, but the United States certainly has for hundreds of years. It manifested that first in becoming a continental scale empire, because the US had to fight its way across North America. What was the United States was just on the eastern seaboard. It had to defeat the Spanish, it had to defeat the French, it had to defeat the Mexicans, it had to defeat the Native American populations. And that took 2 centuries until the end of the 19th century. By then, America was quite full of itself and thought that it was time to go build a global empire. It was behind Europe at the time, because Europe had been at global empire building for centuries, but the United States started its international empire in the 1890s, overthrowing the Kingdom of Hawaii and then making a war out of false pretenses with the Spanish in order to defeat the Spanish and gain the beginning of an empire in the Philippines, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and so forth. Well, the 20th century, America continued to grow and to develop and to create the sense that America was destined for global leadership. And after World War II, with the collapse of the European empires, this was confirmed, but for one obstacle. The United States felt the challenge of the Soviet Union. We had the so-called bipolar world that Wing mentioned. Though the Soviet Union was always economically much smaller and technologically lagging, It was powerful and, of course, a major nuclear power. When the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, and I happened to be in the Kremlin that day when it happened, the United States notion of global dominance went into overdrive. So when the Soviet Union ended, the mindset in the United States was not only de facto are we the only superpower in the world, but this is our destiny to remain the only superpower in the world. We are now in a unipolar world. And that became the hallmark of American policy. And I give you some examples in important influential writing in the United States that basically said, we dominate and we will continue to dominate. And I can tell you in 1992, as I mentioned, nobody was thinking about China in Washington as anything remotely like a competitor or a threat. It was a good place to assemble American electronics. That was about all. But otherwise, it was poor, rice-growing villages and not much to think about. You don't find China mentioned in the strategic doctrines. There was no sense of what was about to come. What was the goal in the United States was to clean up after the Cold War, to eliminate all of the Soviet remnants around that could still be annoying to the US, but basically for the US to run the world after 1991. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, for example, who was an important strategist, wrote a very important book in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard, which described the American strategy. And one of the strategies was, we will expand NATO eastward, and Russia won't be able to do anything about it because, after all, they have no choice but to accede to American power. So the book is a very important book, and all wrong, actually, which is typical of many important books. But the idea is that it is important because it displays the mindset that was at work. And there were crazier people as well, something called the Project for a New American Century, really some of our nastiest people. And what they wanted was global dominance, global hegemony, and they had a particular idea that the Middle East needed to be dominated in close cooperation with Israel. So there was, from the mid-1990s until today, a plan for US and Israeli hegemony, specifically in the Middle East. And that is what the Iran war is about. Trump is the circumstance, but the war and the underlying reasons for it go back decades. And as Netanyahu, who's another megalomaniac mass murderer, said, I hope I'm being clear, and it's important, we need to be clear, by the way, these days, because this is also part of the confusion of official narratives, which is that they're called heads of state, but they're mass murderers, and they need to be described as what they are. Netanyahu said last week that this war in Iran is the culmination of a 40-year dream of his. That's literally the case, because for every year I can recall of the past 30 years, Netanyahu has been calling on us to have a war with Iran. So this is part of a long and deep strategy, but it's part of a mindset. The mindset is the US is the sole superpower, and it needs to stay that way. We're in multiple wars right now. Every one of them has two purposes. One is to subdue the local environment, and the second is to act against China. So the war in Iran is both a war against Iran, but it's also a war against China. The war in Venezuela is a war against Latin America, but it's also a war against China. Why? Because the idea of US power is that it will dominate each region and exclude China from that region. And also, quite specifically, exclude China from receiving the oil and the gas and other resources from the particular region. So the attack on Venezuela was to stop Venezuelan oil from going to China and make sure that it goes to Louisiana instead. The war in the Middle East is also for the US to control the flow of oil from the Middle East, including to turn on and off the flow of oil to China according to the US desires. So all of these wars are part of a bigger strategic view, which is that the United States must act to stop China's rise and to reassert US dominance or hegemony. And just to say, the US remains a very powerful country, no doubt. It's just nowhere near as powerful as it thinks. And while I won't go through every dimension of the analysis that we need, my basic conclusion is the United States is an extremely powerful country with tremendous scale and depth of influence, but it is not the world's sole superpower, not the world's hegemon, not even close. And that American power will wane rather than rise in relative terms because the fundamentals are what counts. And the fundamentals are these graphs. These are trends that will continue. America's share of world output will continue to decline to perhaps 10% of world output in 2060 or 2070, because the US is 4% of the world population and the rest of the world is catching up. So there's no way that America can maintain any kind of global dominance when other regions of the world are rising. And that's the fundamental point to keep in mind. And then all the rest is tactics in a way. And the US toolkit of supposed primacy include the vast array of US military bases around the world, which is America's key source of power. America is the only country in the world that has its military all over the world in supposedly other sovereign countries. 80 countries around the world, around 750 military bases. And the Gulf region is, as we're all learning by the hour, filled with American military bases, which will be destroyed heavily within the next 2 or 3 weeks. Iran is not wrong at all in understanding that it is surrounded by American military bases from Bahrain, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and so forth. And that is part of the American power system. Another part is that America's been the lead military supplier to most of the world until the last 10 years, when Russia and China are becoming more important. Being a military supplier does not just mean you sell your military kit. It means you control your customer, because your military kit can get turned on and off. It needs maintenance. It needs spare parts. Any country that buys from you is dependent on you. It's not a spot transaction. It is a long-term hierarchical dependency. Third, the US aims at, as I'll show you in just a moment, at global control of the oil markets. It doesn't own them. but it has long sought to control them. And it has definitely controlled the Middle East, Gulf countries. It lost control of Iran in 1979, and it's aiming this week to regain control of Iran. And the invasion of Venezuela was all about oil. It was about making sure that North American oil and Latin American oil in general remains under US effective control. So this is just a few quick graphs, which you know. These are countries with US defense alliances. The US dominates. So the American idea is the following for global hegemony. We own the Americas, period. Trump says it out loud. That's our new national security strategy. If you happen to be the hundreds of millions of people living in Latin America, you are a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States. Don't think about doing anything that we, the United States, don't want you to do. That is taken as the first prerequisite and the first assumption. Second, if you are Europe, you are a fully owned subsidiary of the United States. Don't think about saying anything sensible, because anything sensible would admit that fact, and you're not allowed to admit that fact. So we own you, we occupy you, you're part of NATO. Thank you. We have bases in all your countries, and we mean it. This is the American mindset, not my, this is insane in my view. I want you to understand, but this is how they think. Third, we own the Middle East. We have military control over the Persian Gulf, over the Arabian Peninsula, and just to understand Iran, as you know, Iran, well, it has been a sovereign country for about 5,000 years. But we don't want to dwell on that. In 1953, the United States and Britain overthrew the government and installed a police state. So Iran was part of the US system, and the US controlled the Middle East pretty comprehensively up until 1979. The Iranian Revolution, when the Shah was ailing and dying, the Iranian Revolution brought in the current government structure of Iran. Of course, the United States never quite got over that, and from 1980 onward has been trying to overthrow the Iranian government to reassert American full hegemony. Starting in 1980, the US armed Iraq to invade Iran, for example, 1 year after the revolution. In 1982, the United States supplied the precursors for poison gas for Iraq to use against Iran, and so on. That didn't work. The war lasted till 1988, but the Iranian government remained in place. Then the United States put in sanctions already almost 40 years ago that have been in place since then to bring down the government. One American president made a bad mistake, President Obama. He negotiated with Iran. Shame. He reached an agreement with Iran. They didn't want nuclear weapons. They said, we'll be monitored by the UN International Atomic Energy Agency. They complied with everything. So Donald Trump had to run in when he became president and rip up the agreement. Because we don't want an agreement with Iran, we want control of Iran. And so the war that is underway is part of the puzzle to ensure that we have control over West Asia, no exceptions. It's madness. It will not work, but it could lead to catastrophic economic effects. This is the network of, oops, sorry. I thought this was a nice thing. Americans are very lucky because wherever they go to bring freedom, they find oil. This is an Italian journalist. So controlling oil flows is part of the primacy strategy. Controlling them in the Americas is easy because militarily we can't be challenged. Controlling them in the Middle East is a little bit harder, but the US thought that it would be one decapitation strike of Iran's leadership, and then the US and Israel would gain control over Iran. I think that they really believe that. Obviously, it was as much of a delusion as everything else that I'm emphasizing. Let me just show you, these are the world's oil exporters, the 20 main oil exporters of the world. The United States has effective control over about 70% of these oil exporters, in the sense that America has a lock on their foreign policy, typically with military bases and other arrangements that give the US a very strong control. There are 3 countries that you will see here that America does not have control that are important oil exporters. We are at war with all 3 of them right now. So Russia is one, the second is Iran, and the third is Venezuela. It's not a coincidence. We're trying to complete the control over the world oil and gas flows. If we bring Russia through sanctions and Venezuela through invasion and Iran through decapitation and regime change under US control, then it would be fair to say the United States has strong control over about 86% of the world energy flows. And the idea is, as I said, to use that heavily against China, which is heavily dependent on these flows for now. The fact of the matter is that 10 years from now, because of China's build out of alternative energy sources, this isn't going to matter very much anyway. But the American mindset remains in a 20th century tactical mode, which is control the oil, you control the global power. We're also using sanctions regimes, as everybody knows, sanctioning much of the world. And the idea is that these sanctions are enforced by the US payment system. The dollar system, the fact that the US dollar accounts for around 70% of international transactions, means that if you impose sanctions, you can threaten the world with abiding by your sanctions by threatening them with cutting off their banks from the dollar-based international payment system. And that turns out to be quite a powerful way to apply sanctions. So the United States sanctions Iran or Venezuela or Russia or others, and countries that have no interest in abiding by US sanctions do so nonetheless, because the US threatens to cut off their banks if they don't honor the US sanctions. So this is another piece of the toolkit. And I won't go through everything else, but the US claims that it has choke points on sea routes and on advanced semiconductors, on the dollar as a weaponized system. And I would argue that all of these are delusional, that not one of these is really a choke point anymore. Just as an example, what is happening right now in payment systems is that countries very rapidly are turning to non-dollar payments mechanisms. And this is the main activity of the BRICS, actually, which is to create ways to settle that are not vulnerable to US sanctions. And everything that's happening right now is accelerating that. And China will be a key global currency within 10 years, no doubt in my view. So transactions in renminbi internationally will be a maybe 20% of global settlements, and dollar settlements will fall below 50%. And this will end one powerful tactical method of US power, because US power depends on something that is rather easily evaded. Most of the other supposed choke points are not really choke points at all. And I think a telltale sign of the delusion and fading of American power was yesterday's call by Donald Trump to China to open the Strait of Hormuz. Are you kidding? First of all, China is already getting its oil through the Strait of Hormuz because Iran is letting vessels destined for China go through the Strait of Hormuz. So China doesn't have to bail out the US stupidity in this way. But rather pathetically interesting that Trump said so. His great virtue is that he speaks his mixed up mind. He doesn't have the intelligence to hide anything. And so he exposed the incredible weakness of the entire US tactical approach by having to appeal to China, which was the target of the operation to begin with, to go bail out the operation when China doesn't even need to be bailed out. So there you have it, the deep planning of the United States approach. Let me just mention, China has its own very serious choke points, which are probably even more consequential in the short term. We learned about rare earths. I personally knew nothing about rare earth magnets a year ago until I discovered that they could bring the whole world economy to a stop when China threatened to withhold them. That was my first learning about rare earth magnets. But the fact of the matter is that this is one of China's choke points. And China is the key supplier of much of American industry, especially civilian, but also military industry. And if China does militarily quarantine or take over Taiwan, which is absolutely feasible, that also ends the flow of advanced semiconductors to the world markets, but notably to the US. So it is not that the US is in any way alone on this. One last point is, where are we heading in the future? China is ahead on a vast range of technologies of the future, and most importantly of the green technologies. So everything involved with the energy transition, whether it is renewable energy production, photovoltaics, wind turbines, fourth generation nuclear, hydrogen economy, electric vehicles, batteries, and the incorporation of all of those into industrial supply chains. China's way ahead of the United States. And the United States has basically given up because Trump has eliminated all US industrial policies around green technology. So the US has given China the unique global lead in these technologies for the next quarter century. And that is not a very smart thing to do from America's perspective, but it is a very decisive point from the world balance of power going forward. Well, if you try to make an analysis of technology by technology, sorry, I'll just come to if you come to a balance sheet, both the US and China have leadership in particular technology sectors. There's not a decisive lead by China or the US overall, but there's also no reason to believe that the United States has any kind of technology chokehold over China, and the gaps that remain in space technology or in AI or in advanced semiconductors are being closed very, very rapidly. So just to, I'm not even going to use 15 minutes, just to conclude this part. We're in a deep transformation of geopolitics. And the deep transformation has two parts to it that are related. One is the specific end of American predominance and America's reaction to that. And the second, more generally, is the end of Western predominance. The end of Western predominance in the world broadly came with the end of World War II and the end of European imperialism, but it also quantitatively came at the end of the 20th century when the rise of China, the growth of India, the rise of ASEAN, basically the restoration of Asia to more centrality in the world ended what had been essentially 2 to 2.5 centuries of European dominance. There is no reason to believe that this trend is anything but long-term. In other words, there's no reason to believe that the United States can recapture its hegemony or that the Western world will in any way continue to dominate. We are truly in a multipolar world. And while I've emphasized the rise of China, I would also emphasize the rise of India, though it's about 20 years behind China in the timetable. And I would say that other regions of the world, Africa as well, will have very rapid growth and will also shift the balance of power into the future. And this is the sense that we already are in a multipolar world. As I said, we're not in a multilateral world because the United States and Europe don't know how to get along in a world in which Asia has its centrality restored, in which Russia is not the basket case that the West thought it was and claimed it to be. Russia is the largest landmass country in the world, vast natural resources, extremely talented people, 17 million square kilometers, not to be written off and not to be played with the way that Mr. Brzezinski thought that Russia could be played with. So why am I optimistic? Because I don't see this as a general fragmentation of the world or the world gone nuts. I see this as the pain of a transition and a mentality shift that is needed that hasn't occurred. The US and Europe have a supremacist idea that has been quite deep and long-standing. It's a white supremacy, it is a Christian supremacy, it is a historical supremacy, but it was grounded for hundreds of years in the actual facts of life on the planet. And now it's over. And that mindset has not changed, and the self-reflection in the United States doesn't exist at all. These basic points are not understood, are not appreciated. So all we speak of is how can the United States remain number one? How can China be contained? There's no sense that not only is it good and right that China is achieving development, but that it's quite natural after a very strange period in which just one part of the world dominated politically. That sense of history and fairness does not exist. What exists is grandiosity and increasingly delusion. And that's what makes the situation so dangerous. But good news, the American people are not as crazy as their president. This is really important to understand. The American political system is quite broken right now. The fact that a man like Trump can be elected president twice is a sign of a very disordered political system. It's especially a sign of a highly corrupted system. Big money involved in our politics. And last week there was a story that 300 individual givers, 300 billionaires, accounted for 20% of all campaign financing in the 2024 election, 300 people in the country. We know many of them, Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, and the Silicon Valley crowd. And that is a fundamental problem with American politics, which is that it is in the hands of very few, because if you ask the American people, they don't want these wars. They don't care about hegemony and primacy. They would actually like their health care to be affordable. They would like to have housing. They would like to have decent jobs. They would like the schools for their kids to work. That is the essence of American politics, which is that it is not in the hands of the public. The second huge problem is not only the corruption, but the essential fact that foreign policy is in the hands of an even narrower group. And that is a security apparatus which is secret, powerful, unaccountable, and unchecked by basic constitutional systems. You may have seen that a couple of weeks ago, the Senate asked itself, do we want to get involved in the Iran war? And they said, no, thank you. We'll leave it to the executive branch. Well, first of all, from a constitutional point of view, they can't say that. Under the Constitution, only Congress can declare war. What Trump is doing is completely unconstitutional, extra-constitutional, the same way that his tariffs were completely unconstitutional. It is unlikely that the Supreme Court will rule on this one like it did on the tariffs, but the same thing that you saw on the tariffs of a basically executive rule without constitutional constraints applies here as well. And that is the fact that America built a security state after World War II to run all of those 800 or 750 military bases, to have a budget of $1 trillion for the military. And if you add in all the security, it's $1.5 trillion. That's a big apparatus. And you don't leave that in the hands of public opinion or in the hands of Congress. That is owned and operated autonomously, secretly, without any care whatsoever for public opinion, except that once in a while votes come and it can be inconvenient what they're doing. The Iran war was not debated for 5 minutes in the American public. It wasn't even explained till today. We have 50 explanations, all of them contradictory. But the point is, it was a decision taken by a small group. Basically, American foreign policy is run by the CIA most centrally. And the reason for that is just institutional. The CIA is utterly unaccountable and completely secret. So you can run everything there without having to explain anything. And if you watch meetings that take place, any really important diplomatic meeting is not between foreign ministries, it's between security services, because that's where the real foreign policy work is done right now. So this is the second problem that really needs to be overcome. This system has put power into the hands of a few people. If you happen to have a nut at the top, as we do, it becomes absolutely extremely dangerous, because even though he knows nothing, he still is the commander-in-chief. And that seems still to hold most of the time. We once had a president that tried to restrain this system. That was John Kennedy. They killed him. So maybe no president has tried since then to restrain this system. But this is the second feature that we're at. We are in a system in the US that is not in any kind of public control. But if you ask American public opinion, Trump's approval rating is 37%. I find that amazing that as much as 37% agree, but 60% disagree. If you ask about the war, nobody in America really wants this war. So that is good news. So finally, why should we find hope in this? Because this is just too weird to go on. This makes no sense. It has no logic. It can't succeed. It won't succeed. As humans, we're capable of doing stupid, damaging, costly things for quite a while, but it's not as if this is driven by an underlying logic. It's driven by an underlying momentum whose time has long passed. If that's the case, where do I see the world? I see a world of brilliant new technologies, of growing capacity around the world to use those technologies, every possibility of rapid transformation of economies to something cleaner, greener, more productive, and better, given what we have. I don't see limits to that. China's growth of nearly 10% per year for 40 years is a kind of benchmark of what can be achieved. It's not a miracle. It's just the result of very good planning and staying out of war. That's the basis. So if we can get our heads together, we can see a very bright future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. The next phase of the program is a panel discussion of you and Tan Sri Sir Jeffrey Chia. Because since you have not said a lot about Southeast Asia, we would like to hear what Tan Sri Jeffrey Chia would comment about your presentation in general and of what ASEAN could be. Tan Sri, all three. Oh. Well, Tan Sri, we heard an hour-long talk by Jeff about that something rotten in the United States, and afterwards I will ask Jeff why he thinks the rot will heal itself. But first, let's have your reaction to what has been said.
Well, thank you very much for the honor to be sitting up here. As I've always said, I'm just a humble businessman doing business with a heart. And of course, what is going on around, what is happening in the world is disturbing, I must say. And of course, transitional, I would think better times may come after we are all human. We know how to overcome challenges, like in COVID. When we were hit by COVID, men discover, we don't need to meet each other. We have the Teams and the Zoom brought about. So I suppose when oil and all these things are being controlled. I think China and many parts of the world are doing their best to go green, which is fantastic, which we are all here to support. And that's why we support Professor Jeffrey Sachs in his great work of making this world a better world for all of us. And that's why Sunway is fully behind Professor Jeff Sachs and his team. And hopefully we can bring brighter future to the ASEAN region. And I believe that the ASEAN region has come a long way. And Prime Minister Anwar has has done a good job being the chairman last year. And he has brought ASEAN to the world and make the world realizes that ASEAN is coming up nicely and we should be able to do something good to the world with 700 very hardworking people. And I believe that there is a good future for all of us here, provided hopefully like Jeff says that you know the war won't last and census will come into Donald Trump's delusion, and hopefully he will one day say that he has won the war. Okay, let's stop it. I think that would be fantastic news for all of us. But let's see. I'm optimistic by nature. Hopefully, it will happen soon. And I see great future in ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Siri. I think most ASEAN residents would want an ASEAN that is neutral and friendly to everybody. Don't want to be in any sphere of influence. We would like there to be a gigantic buffer zone, and we are within the buffer zone. But neutrality is not something that is achieved by self-proclamation. The big players have to accept that as something forced upon them. Remember the island of Milos, which proclaimed itself neutral to the Athenians? And the Athenians came back and killed every male and shipped off every female. The thing is, the United States or even China see neutrality as a threat. Because if Korea now says it wants to be neutral, Australia says it wants to be neutral, what happens to the US coalition? So neutrality is something we want, but not necessarily granted by the combatants. And to think that we would just go back to normal, Jeff, that somehow Donald Trump is over and then we would go back to sunshine again, I hope that's true. But looking at Biden and Trump, you yourself call them diddle-dee-diddle-dum. So they are not going to change so easily. Just look at the Roman Republic, Jeff. After the murder of Julius Caesar, Octavian took power, and the Roman Republic never went back again. So what has happened in the United States, do you think is reversible? History suggests that the short 200 years of the United States is still shorter than the 500 years of the Roman Republic. I'll stop here. I'd like to hear how we can achieve the neutrality that we desire.
First, as a practical policy suggestion for the world, I would recommend that every country that hosts a military of another country should ask them to go home, because there is no security that comes from hosting a U.S. military base. I think something that Bahrain and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia have learned in the last few days. So my view is the whole idea of overseas military bases is a very bad idea. Bad for the world and as a general principle, and very unusual, by the way, because in the past, you made an empire and you controlled directly the territory. The United States mode of empire was to have a permanent military base in another sovereign country. And I think we're coming to understand that, and I'm hoping that countries that host such bases, and of course, not only of the United States, but also Britain, France, Russia, China, though the number of their bases is much, much smaller, that we could establish a principle of no overseas bases anywhere because we don't need them. There's no cause for them. If you have a navy and it needs to be serviced, it can be serviced in someone else's repair docks, but you don't need an overseas base for that. The world would be a lot safer without it. Of course, Wing's asking whether there's cause for optimism. And my feeling, as I've explained, is that as a very overstretched power that has a lot of internal problems for which these external adventures are very unpopular. We're not in a heyday of empire where we have to convince the American people that this is a wrong approach. Rather, we have a difficult challenge, but I'd say less difficult one, and that is to reestablish policies that actually make sense for the United States interests. And remember that Donald Trump campaigned precisely on the opposite of what he's doing right now. In a way, that's a good sign. To win the election, he had to say, I won't do exactly what he's doing. He said, I will not go to a foreign war. I will not do, I will not have these regime change operations. The reason that they're occurring is that he is himself, as I said, unstable, impulsive, not intelligent, and sitting on top of a vast military machine. And that military machine does rev, and that's why you need a very serious leader that's able to keep the brakes on. And Trump is not a serious leader. But the point that this is not in America's interest is the starting point, Wing, for the answer to this. It's not a guarantee that things will revert. America can become a police state, of course, all on its own. And the military could effectively take over. I don't think that's likely because that is not part of American political culture for the last 250 years. And I would not count that as likely. The Roman Empire, by the way, it took about 1 century for the Republic to become the empire. We're probably something like in our 70th year of this. I say we still have 30 years to go before we lose it entirely. And if I were a betting person, I would say that we will regain control because none of this makes sense. We'll see even in the next days. Most likely, the path that the United States is on is not only legally wrong, morally wrong, but also practically a failure. So it's hard to see good news coming from events of American military in the next weeks. We're much more likely to see mass destruction and a deepening of a global economic crisis. That can be an educational moment for for the U.S. public as well. So I agree with you that there's no guarantee that things will get better. I generally do not believe that they have to get worse to get better. I'd rather that they just get better on their own. But I also think that there are some fundamental reasons why we could see a change. My argument, by the way, I'm publishing something today about how the war can stop, and I lay out a number of specific proposals. But my main proposal is that the leaders of the rest of the world say to the United States, stop. That's, to my mind, the most important point, because I doubt that there, other than Netanyahu, who is equally insane, I doubt that there is any other leader in the world that really views this as wise, prudent, strategic, correct, but they're all afraid to speak. And if they can find their voice, that by itself could make a big difference. So one of the reasons I'm counting on this is the Roman Empire didn't really have a competitor. Its only near competitor was the Parthians, and they were not really a competitor. They could be held off the eastern borders. Eventually, the Germanic tribes conquered the empire, but for a long period of time, there was no challenge. But the United States is in a global world, in a globalized world, I should say. And if the rest of the world would find its voice, this would make a very big difference, because the U.S. cannot resist a united call by the rest of the world to behave itself.
Dan Siri, would you like to add some comments?
Well, my my thinking is, I only hope that the big countries like U.S. and China and Russia can work together. Just imagine if these big powers with fantastic resources and innovation and creativity can work together, we can have flying cars and all this. That's my hope. Okay, so and also that that I'm optimist by nature, as I said. Once we get fantastic technology to have a battery that can store energy, we will have a world of abundance. Just imagine if a battery through the green, through the windmill, through the hydro, and through solar can be stored. And there will be cheap energy everywhere. Then we will have a better world. Hopefully, and I believe that maybe in my lifetime, I can see a lot of this happening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think
Happened, by the way. We had a wonderful opportunity a few weeks ago in China to meet with one of the battery leaders in the world. And it was really a typical Chinese story. A young engineer who was working at CATL, which is China's leading battery maker, in 2019 said, I can see ways to do this even better. This young guy decided he'd start his own company. So he was a startup in 2019. And he said, I could figure out how to make the production run wider, lower the costs, and he's gained a factor 10 in productivity. And in 6 years, he's now the third largest battery company in the world. So this is how fast the advances are taking place. And this is a very smart young engineer who just had a clever idea about how to improve the production. And this is what we're going to see.
Thank you, Jeff. we've got 1 minute more, but because in Sunway, we believe that when it's time to go, we go. But before we do, I want to make a small correction. The fall of the Roman Empire took place over a century, but the Roman Republic was founded in 1582 BC, and the murder of Julius Caesar was 27 BC. So the Republic period itself was less than 500 years.
No. What I was saying, though, was that I was making a different point, which is that all during the 1st century BC, there was erosion of the Roman institutions. The generals started to march on Rome. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 50 BC, I believe. He was assassinated in 44 BC. The traditional date given for the Roman Empire is 27 BC. But all through the 1st century, there was decay. And the decay was that the generals, from Sallust to Pompey, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and so forth, were gaining more and more power at the expense of the Republican institutions. And I'm trying to assess, where is the U.S. on that transition? Because you could say the U.S. is still a republic, but it could become an empire. My view is it's already an empire. And the question is, when did that happen? And 2 dates that for me are very important. One is 1947, when the CIA was created. This was a dreadful mistake. And the second was 1963, when John Kennedy was killed, because that's really the last time that an American president stood up to the military-industrial complex. And so I don't know what history is going to judge about this, but unlike the Roman Empire, I'd like the American Empire to revert to an American republic.
Let's hope that. Well, thank you, Jeff. It's 1 o'clock. It's time. And of course, I must thank the audience for your kind patience. And we hope to see you all here again at a future event.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our eminent speakers as well. We are going to leave here with a lot of food for thought. Our world is changing, but so are our thoughts. And I hope you have a lot of time to sit with these thoughts and evolve your own self. So thank you so much, and see you all another time.